At 3:07 a.m., Karen stood ankle-deep in muddy water, screaming into her phone while her Lexus, her beloved HOA-approved status symbol, floated gracefully down the street like an overpriced yacht in a particularly ugly parade. Streetlights flickered, their reflections shimmering in the flood that had swallowed neatly manicured lawns and pristine driveways. The HOA's once perfect paradise had become an inland sea, and Karen? Well, Karen was its newly dethroned queen, flailing helplessly as her kingdom drowned around her. I leaned against my porch railing, watching the chaos unfold with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had seen this coming from miles away. Coffee in one hand, a slight smirk tugging at my lips. This wasn't revenge. Not really. This was physics, pure and simple. A consequence, not a crime. Somewhere in the distance, a mailbox surrendered to the current, snapping off at the base and drifting away like a tiny white flag of defeat. A garden gnome, once proudly guarding a perfectly trimmed hedge, now bobbed along the floodwaters, its ceramic eyes staring blankly at the destruction. If it had a tiny mouth, I imagined it would be screaming. The sirens in the distance were getting closer. Fire trucks, police, maybe even city engineers, finally waking up to the fact that someone had royally screwed up the drainage system. And Karen, poor, delusional Karen, still hadn't figured it out. I took another sip of coffee, savoring the warmth as I watched her wade through the water, shouting orders at her neighbors like a ship captain barking commands while the hull split in two. She pointed wildly at my property, her mouth moving faster than her brain. She was blaming me. Of course, she was, because it couldn't possibly be the trench. The trench that they dug. The trench that they insisted would solve the runoff issue. The trench that they had arrogantly carved through my land without my consent, as if my property was just another HOA asset to be managed, regulated, and controlled. Oh no, it couldn't be that. I exhaled, my breath visible in the cold night air. Karen had made a mistake, a big one, and she didn't even realize just how badly she had overplayed her hand. But she would. Soon. Very soon. For now, I let the rain do the talking, let the floodwaters rise, and let Karen, for the first time in her clipboard-wielding, rule-enforcing, superiority complex-ridden life, experience what it felt like to be completely and utterly powerless. But of course, you're probably wondering, how did we get here? Let me take you back to when everything was still green, peaceful, and oh so blissfully ignorant. A few months before the flood, before Karen's designer shoes were submerged in ankle-deep HOA-approved disaster, my little corner of the world was a paradise. I lived just beyond the grasp of the Homeowners Association on a modest plot of unincorporated land that, legally speaking, they had no control over. No bylaws, no community guidelines, no passive-aggressive letters about unauthorized color palettes or lawn height compliance. Just me, my home, and my orchard. And my orchard was everything. Rows of pear trees stretched across the backyard, their branches heavy with golden fruit in the summer. Plum trees stood beside them, their deep purple harvests sweet and rich. A stubborn little apple tree, one that had never quite gotten the hang of being productive, sat near the fence line, its twisted branches a testament to persistence. And then there were my figs. My beautiful, perfect figs. It wasn't just a garden. It was therapy. It was history. It was something I had built with my own two hands, watering, pruning, nurturing every tree from sapling to fruit-bearing splendor. The soil here wasn't just dirt. It was 5 years of work, patience, and quiet satisfaction. And Karen hated it. From the moment she first laid eyes on my orchard, she decided it was an eyesore, an unsightly disruption to the HOA's perfectly curated aesthetic. She never said it outright, of course. Karen didn't operate that way. No, she expressed her disdain in the form of polite but pointed comments during neighborhood gatherings. "It's so rustic," she had once said, forcing a smile as she sipped her Chardonnay. Very organic. Translation, it looks like a farm, and I hate it. Other times, she was less subtle. "Have you ever considered landscaping?" she asked one afternoon, standing just outside my property line like a general surveying enemy territory. I had smiled. "I have considered it." Then, after a long pause, I added, "And I've decided against it." That didn't sit well with her. Karen was the kind of person who believed that everything, from the color of your house to the brand of your mailbox, should fit within an approved set of aesthetics. The HOA's vision was one of perfect uniformity. Rows of identical beige houses, neatly trimmed hedges, and driveways free of anything remotely personal. And then there was my orchard, a defiant splash of nature in the middle of their carefully constructed dystopia. At first, Karen tried the usual tricks, sending HOA newsletters to my mailbox, despite the fact that I wasn't a member, casually mentioning property values, dropping hints about community standards. But when none of that worked, her tactics changed. The HOA started looking for problems that didn't exist. First, it was my fence. Does it meet safety regulations? Then it was the leaves from my trees. They're blowing onto HOA property. Then it was my irrigation system. Could it be contributing to excess water retention? Little things, petty things, annoying things. But I ignored it, because at the end of the day, they had no power over me. I wasn't part of their HOA. Their rules didn't apply. Their threats were nothing more than Karen's desperate attempts to assert dominance over something she couldn't control. And that, more than anything, drove her absolutely insane. It started with a puddle, a completely unremarkable puddle, if you ignored the fact that Karen treated it like a national emergency. After a particularly rainy February, a low-lying corner of the HOA neighborhood turned into a shallow pond. Not a flood, not a swamp, just an inconvenient little puddle that reflected the cookie-cutter houses like a funhouse mirror. Now, anyone with functioning eyesight could see the issue. Bad grading. The whole subdivision was designed with aesthetics in mind, not practicality. Perfect green lawns, sure, but no thought given to drainage. Rainwater had nowhere to go except the lowest point of the neighborhood, which unfortunately happened to be Susan from Lot 23's backyard. Susan, as you might guess, wasn't happy. Instead of blaming the actual cause, poor planning, bad engineering, and sheer HOA incompetence, Karen and her ever-loyal sidekick, Dave, from Lot 12, decided they had found the real culprit, me. Or, more specifically, my orchard. At first, I didn't even know I was being accused of ecoterrorism via garden hose. I found out when my address was bolded and in all caps in an HOA-wide email thread. Subject: Community water flow concerns. Dear homeowners, it has come to our attention that a non-compliant external irrigation system may be contributing to excess water retention in adjacent properties. Specifically, the orchard located at address appears to be directing water toward the community. As a reminder, all homeowners are responsible for maintaining proper drainage that does not negatively impact surrounding residences. The HOA is actively investigating this issue and will take appropriate steps to ensure compliance. Thank you for your cooperation. Karen L., Willow Ridge HOA President. I had to read it twice, then a third time. Then I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my coffee. A non-compliant external irrigation system? What were they even talking about? I had no elaborate setup, no underground waterworks, just a basic hose and gravity. And yet, according to Karen, my orchard had somehow single-handedly disrupted the entire neighborhood's water balance. A rational person would have asked me directly. But Karen preferred theatrics. I imagined the HOA meeting that led to this email. Karen standing at the front of a beige-walled conference room, gesturing wildly at a PowerPoint slide labeled Menace to Community Hydrology, pointing at a blurry Google Earth screenshot of my backyard. This is the problem, she'd declare, and the HOA board, probably between sips of overpriced wine, would nod along in solemn agreement. The whole thing was ridiculous. But what I didn't realize at the time was that Karen wasn't just making accusations, she was preparing to act. And I was about to lose far more than just a few trees. The first thing I noticed was the backhoe. At first, I thought it was a mistake, some kind of utility work. Maybe the city had finally decided to do something useful for once. But as I stepped onto my porch, coffee still in hand, I saw it. The trench. It ran like an open wound across the property line, cutting deep into the soil, severing roots, and slicing through the heart of my orchard like it was nothing. Two workers in high-visibility vests stood beside the trench, shovels in hand, chatting like they weren't actively destroying 5 years of my life's work. I barely heard them over the rushing sound of my own pulse. "What the hell is this?" I shouted, storming toward them. One of the workers, mid-40s, beer gut, holding a half-eaten sandwich, shrugged. Drainage improvement. Drainage improvement? I repeated, incredulous. Yeah, HOA hired us. I clenched my jaw so hard my teeth ached. HOA, of course. I looked down at the trench, at the exposed roots, at the butchered remains of my orchard. One of my plum trees had been sheared in half, its branches hanging limply like a broken limb. A fig tree leaned precariously, its roots severed so deeply that it swayed even in the still morning air. The soil I had tended for years, was a chaotic mess of torn earth and uprooted life. They had destroyed everything. And for what? Because of a pot. I turned on my heel and marched straight to Karen's house. The door swung open before I could even knock, and there she stood, smug as ever, glass of Chardonnay in hand, bathrobe perfectly pressed despite it being barely 9 a.m. I didn't waste time. "You dug a trench through my orchard," I said, my voice low, controlled, the kind of calm that preceded hurricanes. Karen took a slow sip of wine before replying, "It was necessary for the community's water management." I laughed. A hollow, disbelieving laugh. "You killed my trees for water management?" She shrugged. "They're just trees." I went still. The rage, the disbelief, the sheer audacity of this woman. "They're just trees," I repeated. She waved a dismissive hand, as if we were discussing trivial landscaping, not the destruction of something I had poured years of my life into. "Honestly, you're being dramatic. This will help everyone. It's just a little trench." A little trench. I looked at her, really looked at her, and in that moment, I realized Karen had no soul. And worse, she didn't care. I could have screamed, I could have raged. But something in me shifted. Karen had made a mistake, a big mistake. She thought this was over. She thought she had won. But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Karen had underestimated one thing. I wasn't the type to roll over and let people walk all over me. Within 24 hours of the trench massacre, I had documented everything. Photos, videos, timestamps, soil samples if necessary, and was sitting in the office of a lawyer named Dan. Dan was one of those guys who always looked vaguely unimpressed, even when he was listening to genuine injustice unfold. I laid it all out for him. The trench, the destruction of my orchard, the blatant trespassing. I even threw in Karen's infamous "they're just trees" comment for dramatic effect. Dan listened, nodded, took a few notes, then leaned back in his chair and sighed. "So," I said expectantly, "what do we do?" He scratched his chin. "Technically, you have a case." "Technically," he shrugged. "It's complicated. The trench was dug right on the property line, but not technically inside your land, so proving significant financial damage would be tricky." I exhaled sharply. "But my trees. They'll argue that those trees' roots extended into HOA land." I blinked. "So? Roots grow." Dan gestured vaguely. "HOA lawyers love technicalities. They'll say the trench was necessary maintenance. They'll say the flooding problem was exacerbated by your orchard's irrigation. And even if you win, you'll spend years in litigation." I narrowed my eyes. "And the cost?" He gave me a look that said, "You won't like this. At least 10 grand up front just to start. And that's before Karen and her legal team stall, countersue, and drown you in HOA bylaws." I gritted my teeth. I wasn't a rich man, and I sure as hell didn't have the time or resources to go to war with an HOA legal machine built for exactly this kind of nonsense. But it got worse, because Karen wasn't done playing dirty. 2 days after my meeting with Dan, I received a formal notice from the HOA, taped to my door like a teenager's passive-aggressive breakup letter. Notice of violation. It has come to the board's attention that recent changes to your property's water management have resulted in an increase in runoff affecting adjacent parcels. Your irrigation system and landscaping modifications are now considered a malicious water diversion effort. You have 30 days to remedy this non-compliance issue or face further action. Willow Ridge HOA President. I stared at the letter for a full minute, absolutely stunned by the audacity. Karen had not only destroyed my orchard, she was now accusing me of causing the flooding in her neighborhood. I laughed. Actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so ridiculous that my brain just gave up trying to process it. But I wasn't going to let this slide. I decided to show up at the next HOA meeting, armed with evidence, logic, and a very deep well of suppressed rage. I walked in with a folder full of before and after photos, contractor estimates for repairs, and city water flow reports. I was prepared for battle. But HOA meetings aren't about logic. They're about power. The moment I stepped inside, Karen barely glanced up from her clipboard. "I'm sorry," she said loudly, ensuring everyone heard, but this meeting is for HOA members only. A few board members murmured in agreement. I have a right to. Karen waved a hand. Security? And just like that, two rent-a-cop security guards, yes, actual security, stepped forward and escorted me out. The last thing I saw before the doors closed was Karen's smug little smirk. She thought she'd won. She thought this was over. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly predict, was that I wasn't just angry anymore. I was inspired. And when a person like me gets inspired, things start to get creative. A week after the rent-a-cops threw me out of the HOA meeting, I thought I had seen the worst of Karen's nonsense. I was wrong. I came home one evening, tired from work, ready to water what was left of my orchard, only to find a brand new drainage pipe cutting straight through my back fence. Not near my fence, not next to my property line. Through it. I stood there, staring at the thick, ugly concrete pipe sticking out like a metallic middle finger, gushing murky runoff water straight into what used to be my orchard. For a full minute, I genuinely thought I was hallucinating. Then I spotted the cut edges of my fence where someone had sawed through it, leaving a gaping hole just wide enough for their little sewer system. No note, no permission, no warning. Just a silent declaration. Your land belongs to the HOA now. I took a deep breath, then another. Then I very calmly placed my coffee on the ground before I lost my goddamn mind. I stormed over to Karen's house, boots splashing through the very water she had dumped onto my property. She answered the door with her usual smugness until she saw my face. What the hell did you do to my fence? I demanded. Karen blinked, then, I swear to God, she had the nerve to look bored. Oh, that! She waved a dismissive hand, like I was asking about a missing lawn ornament instead of a blatant act of trespassing. Necessary community drainage improvements. I stepped forward. You cut through my fence and dumped your water onto my land without even telling me? Karen sighed as if this was all terribly exhausting for her. Look, this area has always been prone to water retention. Your land is the lowest point in the vicinity, so it only makes sense that runoff would be directed here. I stared at her, stunned. You're using my land as a goddamn flood basin. She smiled like she had just explained simple math to a slow child. It's not your land, it's common land. I nearly choked. It's my property. I have the deed, the title. Do you even know what common land means? Karen took another slow sip of her ever-present Chardonnay. Oh, don't be so dramatic. It's just water. I took another deep breath. You're trespassing. You're illegally diverting water onto my property. You, she sighed again, actually sighed, then gave me that fake, condescending smile that made me want to punch a hole through her clipboard. You're welcome to take it up with the HOA board, she said sweetly. I clenched my fists. The same board that threw me out of the last meeting? She didn't even have the decency to pretend she felt bad about it. I turned, marching back toward my ruined orchard, my boots sinking into the muddy disaster Karen had created. That night, I stood by the drainage pipe, flashlight in hand, listening to the steady gurgle of their floodwater soaking into my land. Karen thought she had won. She thought I would just accept it. But she had forgotten something important. When you push a person too far, they push back. Karen thought she had checkmated me. She thought I'd roll over, accept my land's new role as the neighborhood's personal swamp, and just move on. She forgot one thing. I don't play to lose. If the HOA wanted to use my property as their personal drainage pit, then I would simply return the favor. But I wasn't about to act out of rage. Revenge is best served cold and with precise engineering. Enter Eli. Eli was an old college buddy, civil engineer, dry sense of humor, and a talent for solving petty problems with elegant solutions. When I explained the situation to him, he listened in silence, occasionally nodding. I told him about the trench, the ruined orchard, the pipe Karen literally installed through my fence, and how the HOA was now blaming me for their own flooding issues. There was a long pause. Then Eli smirked. You know, he said, if they're using gravity against you, there's no reason you can't return the favor. It was the most beautiful sentence I had ever heard. Operation Reverse Flooding was born. I spent the next 2 weeks working in secret. Step 1, study the terrain. Eli brought a topographic survey map, laser level, and a cooler full of beer. We walked my property for hours, checking slopes, identifying weak points, mapping the flow of water. Turns out, Karen and her HOA had made a huge mistake. The trench they dug worked only because my land absorbed the excess runoff. Their system wasn't actually designed to function properly. It relied on me being passive, which I no longer was. Step 2. Install a covert French drain system. A French drain, for the uninitiated, is essentially an underground slip and slide for water, a buried pipeline that redirects water where you want it to go. Eli helped me design a system that would subtly collect all the runoff the HOA dumped onto my land and return it right back to them. I worked at night, digging trenches along the lowest points of my property, laying perforated piping and covering it with gravel and soil. It was silent, invisible, and, best of all, completely legal. Step 3. Modify the soil. The HOA's plan worked because my land soaked up water like a sponge, so I changed the soil composition. I replaced the soft topsoil with packed clay and gravel, making it harder for water to be absorbed. The next time a storm hit, that water wouldn't sink in, it would move. And thanks to my carefully designed system, it would move right back where it came from. The trap was set. I finished just in time, because according to the forecast, a massive storm was coming. Karen had no idea what was about to hit her. The forecast was grim. Severe storm incoming, the news anchor droned. Expect heavy rainfall, flash flood warnings in low-lying areas. I smiled, because I had very carefully ensured that one of those low-lying areas was Karen's precious HOA neighborhood. By early evening, the first drops fell, pattering gently against rooftops, sidewalks, and the centerpiece of our little tale, the HOA's brilliant trench system. I sat on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the rain pick up. Within an hour, it was pouring. The trench filled quickly, too quickly, because this time my land wasn't absorbing a single drop. Instead of soaking into my soil, the rainwater and redirected runoff rushed straight back into the HOA's pristine paradise. By 10 p.m., the trench was at capacity. By 11 p.m., it overflowed. And by midnight, the entire neighborhood was drowning in its own arrogance. I stepped outside, the storm whipping around me, and took a leisurely stroll toward the chaos. The HOA's over-engineered, over-glorified drainage system had completely failed. Water surged over the trench's edges, spilling into yards, drowning Karen's perfectly manicured flower beds, swallowing sidewalks. Across the street, a patio set floated lazily down a driveway like a doomed ship at sea. Mailboxes tilted, trees swayed, and a rogue garden gnome spun helplessly in the current. And in the center of it all, she stood in the flood, bathrobe clinging to her like a defeated battle flag, staring in horror as her beloved Lexus gently drifted down the street. Her kingdom was underwater. And the best part? They couldn't do a damn thing about it, because in their infinite HOA wisdom, they had neglected to clean out the storm drains, which meant leaves, mulch, and debris from their own landscaping had clogged the grates, turning their pristine suburb into a full-blown disaster zone. By 3 a.m., the sirens arrived. Fire trucks, police, city maintenance. They parked at the entrance of the subdivision, their lights reflecting off the shimmering lake that used to be Karen's perfect cul-de-sac. I sipped my coffee. This wasn't revenge. This was justice. By sunrise, the neighborhood looked like it had hosted an impromptu regatta. Lawns had transformed into muddy wastelands. Sidewalks had vanished beneath a swirling soup of floodwater. The once pristine cul-de-sac was now a makeshift lake, dotted with floating debris, trash cans, and one particularly tragic flamingo lawn ornament doing its best Titanic impression. The HOA was in full-blown panic mode. Karen's precious Lexus towed away. Waterlogged and ruined. Driveways submerged. Basements flooded. And the best part? The residents, the very people Karen had convinced that I was the problem, had turned on her. I watched from my porch as homeowners, still in soaked pajamas, gathered on Karen's front lawn, waving insurance papers, yelling about damages, demanding answers. "You said the system would work, Karen," one woman shrieked, her mascara running down her face like a horror movie villain. "My garage is underwater," a man bellowed, pointing at a submerged SUV. Karen stood on her porch, hair still damp from her 3 a.m. flood panic, clutching a clipboard like it was a life raft. "It was a freak storm," she tried, her voice thin, her confidence cracking. But the HOA board wasn't having it. one particularly angry resident, clipboard-wielding Dave from Lot 12, held up the original drainage plan, the very one Karen had pushed through without testing. "We told you the system was faulty," Dave snapped. "You ignored every warning." Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time in her power-hungry existence, she had nothing to say. And then, as if the universe itself wanted to twist the knife a little deeper, the city officials arrived. A white city maintenance truck pulled up, 2 inspectors stepping out, clipboards in hand, expressions grim. One of them walked right up to Karen and handed her a thick envelope, a formal notice for code violations, for unauthorized modifications, for failing to obtain proper permits. Karen went pale. This is a mistake," she stammered. The city official didn't blink. "Your unauthorized drainage system has caused widespread flooding and property damage. You'll need to present a full remediation plan within 30 days, or you may be held personally liable." Personally liable. Oh, that was beautiful. I leaned back, savoring the scene. Karen, who had built her entire existence around HOA power trips, was now drowning under the weight of her own incompetence. The residents were furious. The HOA board was crumbling. And Karen, she was out of moves, which is why at exactly 9:42 a.m., an envelope slid under my front door. No postage, no return address, just a single typed message: "We need to talk urgently." Karen, I stared at the letter, then at the lake that used to be her kingdom. Then I smiled, because Karen had finally learned something important. You don't mess with a man's orchard. Karen had lost. Her drainage disaster had turned the HOA against her. The city had issued violations, the residents were outraged, and the once pristine neighborhood was now a soggy monument to incompetence. And now, she wanted my help. I arrived at her house just past noon, dressed deliberately in mud-stained jeans and my most wrinkled t-shirt. The same Karen who once sneered at my orchard, who dismissed my ruined trees with "they're just trees," now stood in front of me looking like a woman on the verge of collapse. Her blazer was gone. Her usual Chardonnay was nowhere in sight. She had dark circles under her eyes, her hair pulled back in a way that screamed stress. She motioned for me to sit. I didn't. She cleared her throat. "We need to find a solution." I smiled. "Oh, now we need to find a solution?" She ignored the jab. "The city has issued multiple violations. The HOA is being forced to present a remediation plan, and," she hesitated, "it would be beneficial if you allowed us access to your land to fix the drainage." I let the silence stretch. Then I took a slow step forward, leaned slightly over her pristine kitchen counter, and, for dramatic effect, whispered, "No." Karen blinked. "What?" I straightened, gesturing vaguely to the lake that used to be her neighborhood outside her window. "You all wanted control," I said. "You dug the trench. You ignored the warnings. You used my land like a trash can. And now that it's backfired, you want me to clean it up?" Karen's jaw tightened. "This is serious. People are suing the HOA. Our insurance. Not my problem." Her nostrils flared. "The HOA fees will have to be increased significantly to cover repairs." I nodded solemnly. "Tragic." Her lip curled. "You're enjoying this," I shrugged. "Call it poetic justice." She inhaled sharply, gripping the counter like she wanted to break it in half. I turned to leave, but before I walked out, I gave her one last parting gift. "You know," I said, "if you ever need landscaping advice, I'd be happy to recommend some good drainage solutions." I didn't wait for her response. Karen resigned from the HOA 2 weeks later. The official letter was terse, defensive, and dripping with legal jargon. Effective immediately, I resign as president of the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association. I printed it, framed it, hung it in my tool shed. The HOA was forced to spend every penny of its emergency fund hiring contractors to rip out the failed drainage system and start over. Dues doubled. Residents rioted. The entire HOA board was eventually replaced after multiple lawsuits. And Karen? She sold her house at a loss and moved to a gated community on the other side of town. I wished them luck. I spent the next few months rebuilding the orchard. I took the compensation check from the city once they admitted their permit oversight and used it to restore what was lost. New pear trees, stronger plums, a greenhouse just for fun. The land had been violated, abused, and nearly destroyed, but it came back because nature always finds balance. And as I was gathering the first harvest from my new trees one afternoon, a kid from the neighborhood rode past on his bike, skidding to a stop in front of my fence. He squinted at me. "Hey," he said, "are you the guy who drowned the HOA?" I grinned. "I prefer neighborhood irrigation expert." He laughed. "Cool." Then he pedaled off, and I stood there, a perfectly ripe pear in hand, watching him disappear down the street. The same street that used to belong to Karen.